Deep into the Syrian desert is the town of Al-Hawl. Here in Al-Hawl, metal gates surround what is the world's largest concentration of ISIS members, ISIS supporters, and even the children of former ISIS members. There's roughly 50,000 people living in this open-air prison, most of which want to inflict terror on the rest of the globe. Children are radicalized by their mothers here at a very young age, where all they know is violence against anyone who does not support the Sunni branch of Islam. Young boys are often seen throwing stones at reporters who enter the camp and will shout violent threats at American troops and Syrian military members patrolling the camp. In fact, once boys turn 12 here in Al-Hawl, they become too great of a threat and are then separated from their mothers and brought to different rehabilitation centers around Syria. The goal of these rehabilitation centers is to keep these children away from their mothers, who would communicate the extreme ideologies of ISIS with their children. At the Orkesh Rehabilitation Center, for example, the boys here range from 11 to 18 years old. The boys are taught subjects such as drawing and music, all with the theme of tolerance and peace. They are also taught skills that could be useful for future careers, like becoming a tailor or even a barber. In this dormitory setup, the boys wake up at 7 a.m. and go to classes until 3 p.m., and then they are able to freely play soccer and basketball. Although the schedule for these young men promotes a healthy upbringing, many of these kids still end up in Syrian prisons once they turn 18 and leave the rehabilitation centers. These kids become so radicalized at such a young age because of what their mothers tell them that even several years in the rehabilitation center isn't always able to wipe them of their extreme ideologies. While the 50,000 living in Al-Hawl are mostly wives of ISIS members and their children, the grown men who are suspected to have ties with ISIS are currently being held in one of Syria's maximum security prisons, known as Panorama. There's about 4,000 ISIS fighters here, the largest concentration of grown ISIS men in the world. Not all of these men were once fighting along the evil group, however. Many of the men here are actually locked up simply because of who their parents were. Many of the inmates were children when their parents brought them to Syria and Iraq to fight with ISIS, and now have to grow up in a maximum security prison. The living conditions inside this prison are said to be some of the worst in the world, where inmates are confined in cells with 25 other suspected ISIS members. The inmates spend 23 hours a day in these cells and are held indefinitely without charge. While escaping from this prison is nearly impossible, back in the camp of Al-Hawl, a couple dozen children are actually able to escape each month. These boys are smuggled out of Al-Hawl and brought to ISIS training camps around northeast Syria. Very few of these training camps still remain, considering the vast majority of grown ISIS men are spending time in the Panorama prison. Many of these children would have grown up in peaceful communities in countries like Finland, Australia, and even the United States, but their parents were once radicalized and felt the need to move to the Middle East to join forces with ISIS. ISIS first began their massive recruitment campaign back in 2011. At this time, the name ISIS hadn't even formed yet, and the group was operating under the name Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was a Sunni jihadist group founded by Osama bin Laden, a ruthless leader who couldn't have even predicted how large the group would become after his death. 2011 was a monumental year in the Middle East, as on December 18, 2011, the United States withdrew its very last military troop from Iraq, leaving the country on its own to defend itself from armed uprisings. These armed uprisings were coming from Sunni Muslim groups, which is a branch of Islam. The largest branch of Islam is known as Shia, and is what most of the country and its political leaders practiced. The leader of Iraq at the time was a man named Nouri al-Maliki, a practicing Shia, and one that was extremely paranoid of any potential Sunni uprisings. The literal day after the United States withdrew its last troop from Iraq, now on December 19, 2011, al-Maliki ordered the arrest of his vice president, accusing him of having bodyguards that were linked to terrorism. Other strange events would take place in the following weeks of the United States leaving Iraq, such as random deceased bodies being found lying in towns, always belonging to Sunni Muslims. This was very suspicious, considering al-Maliki was known to be paranoid of potential Sunni uprisings that could put an end to his power. Meanwhile, in the western desert regions of Iraq, the Sunni group Al-Qaeda was extremely small in numbers, but had dedicated fighters that wanted to make a resurgence in the Middle East. These were men that the United States didn't manage to kill, but their numbers had been reduced so low that they weren't seen as a major threat any longer. Little did Iraq and the United States know, this small group of radicalized men would soon spark the largest jihadist uprising in human history. In the summer of 2011, a man named Abu al-Baghdadi was the leader of what was left of Al-Qaeda. Al-Baghdadi sent some of his Al-Qaeda followers over into Syria to fight alongside other Sunni rebels that were in a civil war against their government. These Sunni rebels in Syria despised their leader at the time, Bashar al-Assad. These Sunni rebels in Syria were much like the Al-Qaeda Sunnis in Iraq, and these two groups were quickly able to form a strong relationship. The message Al-Qaeda was spreading in Syria was gaining extremely fast traction, and their group soon began growing rapidly. Al-Baghdadi saw that these Sunnis in Syria needed more manpower, and eventually sent more and more of his Al-Qaeda followers over to Syria to fight in their civil war against the government. Many rich Sunni Muslims living in Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar started funding these Sunni opposition groups in Syria and Iraq, not paying too close of attention as to what these groups actually stood for. As Al-Qaeda was gaining more ground in Syria, they were soon able to rely less on donations, as with this newly acquired land, they were becoming more self-sustainable. Al-Qaeda was able to rob Syrian banks, control transportation routes, and even took control of many Syrian oil fields. Taking control of these oil fields was a game changer financially for Al-Qaeda, as they could sell this oil on the black market and get paid in cash, a form of currency that couldn't get frozen by a bank. Once Al-Qaeda built up their forces in Syria and gained control of much of the country, they were now ready to expand back into Iraq. This was going to be a tougher task than operating in Syria, considering the Iraqi military now had access to some of the United States military equipment. Al-Qaeda knew they were up for a challenge moving back into Iraq, and decided to implement a strategy that Iraq didn't see coming. Al-Baghdadi ordered his followers to attack the prisons in the western regions of the country with the goal of freeing all the inmates. The prisons weren't prepared for this attack, and Al-Qaeda was successfully able to free the inmates and immediately radicalize them into joining forces. Al-Qaeda was making major ground in western Iraq with all these former inmates, and around this time in March of 2013 is when we saw the first ISIS flags flying. ISIS stood for the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, which was now applicable given their presence in both countries. The newly named ISIS wasn't facing much pushback from the Iraqi military up until April of 2013. In the town of Hawija, the population living here was largely Sunni Muslims occupying what was known as a protest camp. The Iraq president at the time, al-Maliki, ordered the Iraq military to go into this camp and destroy every Sunni Muslim, referring to themselves as belonging to ISIS. This was a major turning point in the Sunni Muslims' relationship with Iraq, as up until this point, ISIS was actually avoiding true violence against the government. ISIS was trying civil disobedience in the form of protesting. They tried sectioning off their own land in Iraq, and even tried voting out al-Maliki in elections, but none of this worked. When this group that was living in Hawija was blindsided by the Iraqi government, that is when they decided to fight fire with fire. This new group known as ISIS turned towards violence and began arming themselves with weapons. There were many moderate Sunni Muslims living in Iraq at the time that felt like they had no choice but to side with ISIS, considering these were the only people standing up for the Sunni community. 3 months after the attack on the protest camp in Hawija, ISIS enacted its first major attack close to the city of Baghdad, where they were also able to free over 500 hostages from the Abu Ghraib prison. ISIS began bringing more Sunni rebels from Syria into Iraq, and it soon became clear that it didn't seem like the Iraqi military was going to be able to stop this new ISIS advance. Anytime the president of Iraq, al-Maliki, would launch a counterattack against ISIS, this would end up provoking ISIS to gain more and more followers. Al-Maliki was also using new weaponry that the United States gave Iraq, which proved to be much more powerful than what ISIS was used to seeing. Also around this time, the Shia Muslims Muslims who were in control of Iraq banned Sunni Muslims from being able to participate in the government. This was just another decision that led to the monster that ISIS would become. ISIS had moved into many of the suburbs of Baghdad, Iraq's largest city and the capital, and now had their eyes on the second largest city, Mosul. On June 6, 2014, ISIS sent several suicide car bombers into downtown Mosul. Accompanied by them were ISIS fighters and pickup trucks. In some neighborhoods around Mosul, ISIS was actually welcomed, considering many in the region were not supportive of al-Maliki's Shia regime. It took ISIS 6 days to gain control over Mosul, and now the group had access to American weaponry like M1A1 tanks. From Mosul, ISIS rapidly expanded down the Tigris River, first capturing Qayyara, then al-Shakat, Hawija, and then Tikrit. ISIS was able to round up several hundred Iraqi soldiers in these towns and even recorded their executions. ISIS also didn't believe in any borders, so they used bulldozers to destroy the barriers that was separating Iraq from Syria. ISIS was now able to officially establish their own caliphate, with their leader being al-Baghdadi. ISIS had land that now stretched multiple countries, and they were about to go after their biggest target yet, Erbil, which was part of Kurdistan. This region, known as Kurdistan, was different from the rest of Iraq in that there were over 40 United States advisors there at the time. There's also over $1 trillion worth of global energy companies that rely heavily on this region for their natural resources, such as Chevron and ExxonMobil. It was this threat to Erbil that prompted the United States to finally intervene. The United States wanted to help out Iraq, but only if the Iraqi president al-Maliki would resign. A week later, al-Maliki shockingly resigned, and the United States airstrikes stepped up. By this point, ISIS controlled regions in Iraq and Syria that were pretty staggering in size, compared to where this group came from in 2011, with a couple extremists living in the western desert region of Iraq. ISIS was using the rise of social media to recruit new members, many of whom were flying in from very established countries like Russia, England, and even the United States. When the United States began sending airstrikes into ISIS strongholds in Iraq and Syria, the group was not at all equipped to defend itself from these air attacks. This is when ISIS knew their days of capturing new land was probably coming to an end, and turned to extremely brutal attacks on Shia Muslims, foreigners, and even American hostages instead. ISIS eventually got pushed out of Iraq and had their last strongholds on Syrian towns, specifically Raqqa. On October 17, 2017, the Syrian Democratic Forces regained control of Raqqa, and now ISIS was mainly limited to desert towns in the remote regions of Syria. Many of their men had been decimated, leaving behind families full of children and wives. Fast forward 2 years later, on March 23, 2019, the Caliphate of ISIS officially fell when the Syrian Democratic Forces took back the last town of Baghouz, and their leader al-Baghdadi even died in an explosion. Although the Caliphate may have come to an end, and the vast majority of the men in ISIS had been killed by airstrikes, there were still thousands of women and children who had been radicalized by ISIS left behind. The Syrian government knew that these remaining people could easily one day spark a new resurgence. That's when the Syrian government decided to move all these remaining ISIS members to either prisons, or in the women and children's case, the refugee camp that we examined in the beginning of this video, known as Al-Hawl. Now, although this camp has the highest concentration of ISIS supporters in the world, there's actually supporters of ISIS scattered across the globe. The United States has identified over 400 immigrants that have come to America in the past 3 years that were brought by ISIS-affiliated human smuggling network groups. 200 of these immigrants were apprehended when they first got to the United States, but 150 of them were arrested once they had already been set free into the country, and another 50 of them still have whereabouts that are unknown. It's believed that there's still former ISIS fighters living in other Western countries around the globe, but as to how many still remains largely unknown. If it wasn't for the United States stepping in and sending airstrikes into Iraq and Syria aimed at ISIS, it's likely that the group would still be operating in the Middle East today. Another one of the United States' close military partners is Israel, which has been in a major war of its own. Israel has developed a nearly unbeatable defense strategy, which has completely outsmarted most other Arab countries. You can find out exactly what that strategy is in this video right here.